Hello and welcome to Politics and the Economy 1974 to 1979 History Revision Podcast. The 1974 February election was run on who governs Britain. Heath asked this, and it wasn't really him as the answer, but then it wasn't really Wilson either. It was an inconclusive hung parliament. Had Heath retained the Unionist vote from Northern Ireland, he would have won. Enoch Powell now joined them and was campaigning against Heath. Labour won 5 more seats than the Conservatives, but in a hung parliament, the incumbent gets to try and form a coalition first, which Heath tried to do half-heartedly with the Liberals, who again have made quite a comeback, as did the national parties from Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales. This coalition failed, and then Wilson got the opportunity to take over. There was little expectation on this government, unlike in 1964, as they had to rely on support from other parties, and they were hardly going to pass radical socialist policies doing this. They decided not to make a deal with the Liberals, and Wilson was sure there would be a new election soon, so he didn't feel like he needed to. They settled the miners' dispute within 2 days of the election and abolished the Industrial Relations Act and the pay board. They tried not to annoy the unions. Wilson was now older, less energetic, and presiding over an awful economic situation with a divided party. So he calls another election in October 1974, and the voters still associated Heath with the miners' strike in the three-day week, and Labour ended up increasing their vote and got a 3-seat majority, which is not a very big one. So what were Labour's policies 1974 to 79? Well, it's difficult because there was an increasing left-right-wing split in the party. Tony Benn and Michael Foot joined the cabinet, but the great offices of state were reserved for the right of the party, such as Healy, Jenkins and Callaghan. Their most important task really, rather than policy, was to survive, because it could be defeated at almost any time in the House of Commons. It was a policy of self-preservation and no disasters. This was reflected in the October manifesto, which was pretty a cautious fare. There was no desire this time for innovation and modernisation. They did want a referendum on Europe, but really that was to stop a split in the party from Wilson's point of view. They brought in the Health and Safety Act in 1974, the Equal Pay Act was strengthened, and race relations legislation was strengthened. And there were devolution referendums in March 1979 and the abolition of Keynesian policies after the 1976 IMF loan. Wilson, up to 1976 when he resigned, had been happy to take less of a leading role. He seemed to be on a good terms with the unions, says Lynch anyway, and made a social contract before his election win in 74, in 1972, that when Labour returned to power they would adopt pro-worker industrial policies in return for wage restraint from the trade unions. There are actually a few examples of unions restricting their wage claims in this period. Under Wilson, inflation had shot up as huge wage rises were allowed. This was to get out the problems with the unions, and inflation went up to 20%. Tax increases in 1975 budget and the wage increases limited to 3% in 1976 budget angered the left. British Leyland was nationalised and lame ducks were being helped again. Stagflation was back. Wilson then surprisingly resigned in March 1976, and there's been much speculation as to why. Some say he promised his wife he would leave politics at the age of 60. Some say that there were plots against him, and this was even encouraged by Wilson himself, who continually told people he was being bugged. Literally, not just annoyed. Some people have said he wanted to leave office before the economy crashed, and some have said that his memory was fading and that he had the early onset of Alzheimer's disease. Anyway, Callaghan easily beat Foot in a leadership contest after he resigned, and Callaghan was seen as a safe pair of hands. But Callaghan had to face lots of problems as well. There was the oil price rise, which, whilst not under his premiership, had caused a deep and long-lasting consequence for the economy. This had negated any benefit from the EEC entry, and we had suffered from poor terms of entry in desperation to get in the EEC, at a time when our exports to Europe were decreasing anyway. By-elections had also ended Labour's majority, and the Northern Ireland deadlock also caused problems for Callaghan. There were a rising amount of strikes, with even more moderate unions becoming involved. The split in the party got ever worse. There's grassroots activism at a local level which took the party to the left. For example, militant tendency and other extreme groups got involved. The perceived failures of the 1964-70 government in doing enough reform sowed the seeds for the grassroots revolt, wanting a greater accountability for Labour MPs when they were in government to the party. Tony Benn himself moved to the left and became a rallying point for all things to do with the left. There was an antiquated party structure with conflict between the Conference, which is the NEC, the National Executive Committee, the PLP, the Parliamentary Labour Party, and the leader of the party. The NEC was dominated by the left, and all this caused a split in the party and a decline in the authority of its government and leadership. Callaghan was also facing the problem of devolution, and the lack of a decisive outcome on that led to loss of support from the Scottish National Party and Plaid Cymru, but mainly the SNP.